Rita Ennen is speaking next. She earned her MLIS from the University of North Texas, as did I. She has been the director at the Dickinson Area Public Library since 2014, and prior to that, she served 7 years as the director of library services at DSU. So take it away, Rita.
All right, hello everyone. I hope I'm going to be able to share my screen here in a minute. It looks like that I probably can. But the other thing I will tell you is currently I am serving the place for the North Dakota Library Association as their liaison on the ALA's State of the States for intellectual freedom, which is how it is that I come to be talking to you about that today. There we go. All right. So I'm looking forward to sharing some information about censorship. We will, at the end of this presentation, be looking at the newly announced just last week top 10 banned books from 2020. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about what censorship is. We're going to talk about reporting and why that's important. So I'm going to front load this with a couple of statements that are important. First of all, in order to report challenges, you do not have to be a member of the American Library Association or NDLA. You can report and use their services regarding challenges or book bans without needing to be a member. So they want that to be something that's broadly available. You also should know that ALA offers a lot of assistance, but that does not mean they take over your local process. It does not mean that if you reach out to them for help, that they will dictate to you what you get to do. It's truly just help and guidance in whatever way you need it, but still your local school board or your local library board is in charge, if you will. So don't be shy about asking them for their help or encouragement whenever you might need it. So I like the Books Unite Us graphic they have there, and you should know that you go out to ALA's site and they have a lot of these kinds of materials available, and they are available for whomever would use them. You do not have to ask for permission. You do not have to be, as I said, an ALA member to be able to use their materials. So my first slide here, I started out with one of the brand new things that they've just put out. And this lets you know that when ALA tracks challenges, it's not just that person who's complaining about a book. So about 73% of the challenges that they tracked for 2020 were challenges to books or graphic novels, but they also help and assist and keep track of challenges to programs and meeting rooms, social media, displays and photos. I think many of you know that West Fargo had a challenge to a display. Was that 2 or 3 years ago? Films. So anything that's being challenged, they offer their help and they do try to keep track of it. They also have slides about things like who initiates challenges. About 50% of that would be parents. And that goes with the fact that a little more than 50% of challenges are normally in schools or school libraries. So just some background information for you. As we're talking about intellectual freedom, that sounds like, I don't know, to me always it sounded like this impressive thing, but what does it really mean? And then people talk about the First Amendment. So whenever we're talking this, I think it's useful to go and look at what the First Amendment actually is. These are the words that are there, not my interpretation of them, etc. A lot of people talk about the First Amendment, but they haven't looked at what it actually is. The other thing that makes this really important at this particular time in our history, I find it helpful and encouraging that you go all the way back to the beginning of our Constitution and you see the first thing they had to do was start making amendments. So there has been, for as long as the US has been a country, there's been robust dispute, if you will, even between those founding fathers about what the Constitution should and should not say. It was not something that passed easily if you study it. Maybe sometime for NDLA, I have a friend who's a constitutional scholar and people might find him interesting. But for our purposes, the First Amendment, and this is the one slide that I will actually read. It says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So that's a lot of stuff that's all packed into this First Amendment. And for our purposes today, we're going to talk about the section regarding abridging the freedom of speech or the press. Meanwhile, I'm sure I just have to throw this in there. I'm originally from Minnesota. I have a daughter that lives in Edina, which is one of the suburbs of the cities. And if you pay any attention to the news and what's been going on there, one of the things that is important to note that people have the right to peaceably assemble. So I just throw that out. But right now we're going to say, for our purposes today, what we're talking about is Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So then we get on to what exactly does that mean? What is, this is what we call freedom of speech. What is freedom of speech? So in law, and as this has been interpreted, you need to know it's not only oral and written language. It is any way in which ideas are expressed. So that's why people can challenge artwork. They can challenge statements that are on signs or inside of public buildings. It's any way in which people express themselves, basically. Then we come down to facts and opinions. In the end, that is where librarians fall with a lot of responsibility to find our ways in which we can encourage people to know how to examine information for its authenticity and whether it is truthful or just has any backing or is just somebody's opinion about things. Opinions are absolutely can be expressed, but it's then on the user or on the hearer to discern, is this just somebody's opinion or is there some backing for it? Freedom of speech, is it popular or not popular? Again, this is where libraries, particularly with book challenges or challenges to meeting room policies and those kinds of things, just because something is popular with the board or your mayor doesn't mean that it has to be the opinion for everyone. And just because something is unpopular with one of those people doesn't mean that that determines what everyone else is allowed to say or think either. And that, of course, comes into our collection decisions. One of the founders' purposes with the First Amendment, they found it so important that they wanted people to feel that they had a voice in their government, and they wanted people to disagree. And right now we are at a point in time, to my way of thinking anyway, where we're finding a lot of difficulty with disagreeing with each other civilly. And one of the things we need to know is that that disagreement is an important thing to have happen. Let's have robust engagement. It would have been 2 meetings ago, we had a vote on something for the first time ever with the library board where we had a dissenting opinion. And I was actually really excited about that and made a point of making sure that the person who disagreed and voted no knew how much I appreciated that they were willing to do that, because that means that your board discussions and your decisions are more real, more equitable. So robust engagement. And freedom of speech does not equal the freedom to hear or experience something. And that's where people need to understand that just because you have a right to express your opinion does not mean that anyone else must hear your opinion or that they must participate in your program, etc. And that's one of the things that's a protection for us in many ways too when we're dealing with challenges, because we look at people and say, okay, you don't like that, that's fine, don't participate. You don't like that book, don't read it. Don't allow your kids to read it. That does not mean that someone else may not find that useful. So from there, we go to censorship. And what is censorship exactly? I don't think we understand it real well sometimes. But censorship is suppressing or prohibiting any part of an intellectual expression, as we were saying earlier. So it can be a part of a book, it can be a part of a film, it can be a piece of artwork in an exhibition. If it is prohibited or suppressed, that is censorship. It's action that's taken to impose a particular viewpoint for everyone. So this is where we get into some of the political stuff. Because this is your mayor's viewpoint does not mean that everyone must hold that same view or that that's the only one that can be allowed to be expressed. Censorship, as we get to working with it in a more personal way with people, it's you want to get rid of something for everybody because it's offensive to you. So I have this book, it offends me, therefore no one is allowed to read it. That's what a ban does. And that is actual censorship. Important to know that censorship is an action that's generally taken by a government or a controlling body. So for instance, my shelf at home, I have things that I choose to exclude. I have every right to do that. That's different from a person in a place of authority deciding that the library is going to exclude that same material. So as I go through my slides, I do have just a few pictures, and they're pictures of things that have been censored or banned in some places. And I throw the Bible in there deliberately at the beginning, most of the time when I'm talking about this, because that's a good place to let some people know, okay, this is precious to you, but there are people and places in the world, and even in the United States, where the Bible or parts of it have been prohibited. You don't want your holy book prohibited. This is the one thing out of all of this that I will say is truly mine, if you will. Always my expression is that if you want to protect freedom for yourself, you need to protect it for everyone, including and most importantly, sometimes those who do not agree with you. So that's why I use that image first on most of these kinds of presentations.
Rita,
now we're going to get, yes.
Do you want questions as we go along, or do you want them saved for the end?
You know, jump in at any point.
Okay, so I have a question on the censorship angle, and that social unrest you kind of alluded to earlier. Does your presentation address later, or could you address briefly? You know, we all saw the articles about the Dr. Seuss books that are no longer being published, and that sparked a huge conversation. So where do you fall on the whole EDI and censoring? You know, like there's been talk about Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer for years because of the use of, you know, a word that today we would find very offensive. So where does that fit into the censorship conversation?
So first of all, that's one of those things where robust engagement is very important, and it's been exciting to follow what the library community is saying. Regarding Dr. Seuss, and now I'm speaking for myself and not in any official position whatsoever, there's a large difference between them saying that we're not going to put out a new edition of something and them saying we're going to burn all the old copies, if you will. That, to me, that's kind of where I fall down on it. Excuse me, my voice is a little gruff this morning. So in the end, part of intellectual freedom is that a person owns their own thoughts and their own ideas. And we know that books are owned by an author or a person that owns a copyright. And in the end, they do have a right to make some decisions about that. We can say, you think nobody wants this book anymore, you're not publishing a new edition, but you're mistaken about that. A whole bunch of us are going to get together and say, yes, in fact, we would like to have this. But they have a right to make those kinds of decisions. Because they make a decision that for whatever reason, they're not going to put out any or offer for sale any more copies, that does not dictate what you do with the copies you've already got. So Mary, I'm going to ask you, I'd like to know, what do you think? Where do you fall on this issue?
Part of why I asked the questions because a lot of us got contacted by reporters, and I would fall back on the collection development policy and addressing this in your collection development policy. And then really, again, libraries don't censor. I think it's an opportunity to convene some of those robust collections within your community and
Absolutely.
have conversations on social justice. And there is also some importance to those historical documents that we
Absolutely.
can learn from. And so that's where I tend to fall on the, we don't delete something just because it is offensive by today's standards.
Right.
But we also have to be thoughtful in how we have it in our collection.
Right.
Can I chime in with a thought? Because we've actually been talking about this quite a bit in my MLIS classes, and then also in public with some people I have. But what I kind of compared it to is the Twitter and Facebook banning certain speech and all that kind of stuff, and people wanting to scream about their First Amendment rights being violated. What a lot of people don't realize, that's what, these kids I go to school with and stuff, is the First Amendment protects you against the government. It doesn't protect you from a private industry not wanting to publish what you print. So you could write anything you want to. Doesn't mean anybody has to publish it. All it means is the government can't make somebody not publish it if they want to.
Yeah, that great point. And that goes to what I was saying. The owners of the material have the right to say, we aren't giving it to you anymore. It's theirs. And that falls into copyright and some of those other precious to library issues that we have. But once again, because they said they're not going to publish it anymore, does not mean that you have to get rid of the copy you currently have. You should follow your collection development policy. And it's an interesting conversation. And it's funny because we will see an image of Huck Finn as I go a little further on into my conversation, but you made a good point there. That something that was the thought at a particular point in time, you have the opportunity to address that. You have the opportunity to address that with your kids, with your class. And in the end, you don't have any control over what somebody else does with an expression or how they think or feel. I have my Twitter and Facebook is, as Paul pointed out, another interesting place where you talk about this. And to me, some of it comes down to the fact that you have a right to have a, let me find the words actually as it is, the right to peaceably assemble. You have the right to peaceably dissent. And I think we have a lot still to learn in our social discourse about how we do that in a civil and a peaceable fashion. And part of that is thinking about the ways in which we express ourselves. Part of that is thinking about the ways in which we accept other people's expression too. Those are just my thoughts on that subject. Does anybody else have something they want to say about that while we're here? Have any of your libraries made decisions about those books?
I believe the state library did not own any of the 3 titles of the Dr. Seuss books. But as we were working on our strategic plan, that came up at the ELT level as to, as we're looking at our collection and as we're adopting EDI as a guiding principle, what are the natural implications for our collection development policy and process, based on EDI best practices.
Right. So chime in or share your thoughts, and Sherry is watching the chat, so she'll help us there. But we go on next. I'm going to point out to you, or one of the things that I'm sure Paul has gotten to in his classes, or I know we did, do libraries censor? Is it censoring when we read? Is it censoring when we choose what we buy? And we're going to get to some more thoughts on that in a minute. But I would say that libraries sometimes, and individuals who use libraries sometimes, censor in ways that we don't think about. So what are those kinds of things? Do we have something on a higher shelf? Do we have something in a locked cabinet? And I will share, when I came to the library here, we do have locked cabinets. We have some that have local history items in them because they are irreplaceable and people ask and we allow them to use them in the building. They don't go out. But when I first came here, there was a very special locked cabinet. It had in it the library's copy of Mein Kampf. It had in it anything at all that was Wiccan or had to do with spells or that sort of thing. And it had in it anything that was written geared towards children that had to do with human anatomy. And I have understanding of the time when that came about and how those things happened. That cabinet has been emptied and those materials are on the shelves, is the decision that was made when we came to address it, because we do believe it's censorship in a way, for the fact that it means that if you want to go looking for those materials, you have to specifically know what you're looking for and ask somebody to get it for you. Reasons given were that some of those materials have been stolen in the past. Well, we run that risk with literally anything that's on our shelves anywhere. And are some things more likely than others? I don't know. I personally, and through discussion with library board and others, fell down on the side of that's a risk of doing business, if you will, in the library, and we should not make it harder for somebody to access that material just because we think that that they might decide to steal it or that they might protest it, and we don't want to have to deal with the protest. Honestly, that was a portion of particularly having children's materials dealing with human anatomy locked away. So there's also things like defacing the item. I will share this too in a library that I worked in many years ago. I happened to be an academic library in another state, and those of you that know me will know where it was then. But the swimsuit issue, they had somebody that would take swimsuit issue of Sports Illustrated, would take black marker and draw a very conservative swimsuit on top of all of the models so that nobody would steal or deface that issue. Theft is a way in which some people censor. They decide there's an item there for the library, I don't like it, I'm going to take it and not bring it back. Those things do happen. I would say that censorship in a library is any effort that makes material more difficult for people that want it to access. And now then you come down to, once again, we do have local history items that we know are irreplaceable that are in a cabinet that is locked. This is a point where I'd be interested to hear other people's stories or their thoughts about the ways in which libraries maybe censor, or where is it or is it not appropriate.
So Rita, I'll share a funny story from way back in the day. I was a young baby librarian, and I was walking behind the circulation desk right as my boss slammed her hand down on the table and said, "There will be no more sex in this library." And I was like, what? There was a particular, I can't remember the exact title of it now, but there was a particular book that kept getting stolen by teens because it was kind of that anatomy and sex positions and stuff. And she got tired of reordering it. And so she just dropped her hand down, and the timing was just hilarious. But yeah, and we didn't buy it anymore because she said we had spent enough taxpayer dollars replacing that. But that is a form of censorship right there, because like you said, it is the cost of doing business. I think another censorship thing that a lot of libraries do, and they don't think of it this way, is when they put the DVD case on the shelf, but the DVD is behind the desk in a cabinet. And so when the patron goes to check it out, and again, it's a theft deterrent, but it also does make it tougher for patrons to access the materials.
And I think you really need to think about it anytime where you're going to make somebody specially ask you for one thing where they maybe wouldn't something else. In the end, somebody has a DVD they want to check out. Ours are locked. We do unlock it. But really, in the end, it's none of our business what that is. We unlock it, make sure there's a DVD inside of there, check it out. They shouldn't have to have you know what particular title it is that they want and go and get it off a shelf somewhere, I think is what you're saying, and I would agree with that.
See, I think where the locked room or the locked cabinet is concerned, it depends what you got in there. If you have the one of a kinds like we do here, as long as you're allowing anybody access who asks, it's not censorship. You're just protecting something you can't replace. Now, it's different if you're putting certain books in there that you don't want people to read, and then you're saying, well, I'll let you look at it, but I'm not going to let you look at it. That would be censorship. But if all you're doing is protecting it and anybody who asks can look at it, I don't think that's really censorship.
Right.
I do know of one library in the Chicago suburbs, and I don't know if they still do it because that director has retired, but they used to they wanted to go, they sort of went the other direction with the whole censorship thing. And so they subscribed to Playboy magazine, but they kept it behind the circ desk, and you had to like produce a driver's license to check it out to show that you were of age. That's just that's really for the purpose of making a point, like we don't censor in this library, but really, if you're going to buy the resource, people should be allowed to check it out without having to jump through a bunch of hoops.
Right.
Rita, what would you say about a library that like limits access to R-rated movies by kids, where, either you have to be over 18 to check it out, or your parents have to sign like permission when you get your library card?
So, and we've had that discussion here. It was a couple of years ago. And I will just say, we have certain things that you have to have an adult card for. And so, but namely things like our new game collection and our video games, check out only on an adult card. We have some learning bundles for kids, and we ask that an adult check those out. So how do you go with that? On the other hand, our R-rated movies, our movie collection is there, and we don't worry about who checks that out. One thing I don't think, in fact, is I know I don't have in my slides, but is important when we're having this kind of conversation is, does the library function, as I say, in loco parentis, in the place of the parent? And that can be a different discussion sometimes for schools than it is for a public library. And as you know, our library functions in a realm that's a little bit of both of that. And there are others I know that do far more so. For me and for our library, as we had this discussion, we do not stand in the place of the parent. It is my feeling on these issues that every parent has the right, the responsibility to be aware of what their children are learning and what they're doing, and to be having the conversations that they need to have with their child. And that is up to them. I would also say that what you do with your child is your business, but you don't get to dictate to someone else's family. And so for us, we don't worry about the rating on things. It is plainly marked on our DVDs. And so if a parent needs to pay attention to what their kids have. That's their job. It's not our job. And particularly also because what one family needs or is experiencing may be very different from another. That's my thought on that subject. What do you think, Mary?
No, I mean, I agree with that. I do think sometimes libraries put restrictions in place because it's super expensive and they don't want a kid to check out something that the parents then going to be on the hook to pay for if it gets lost or damaged. I used to always say to patrons when I was at the public library, you don't want me setting the restrictions, because I was way stricter with my son on movies and music, until he started driving himself. And so you don't want me setting what your kid can or can't watch, because I may have a very different, definition of that than you do. And so I think it's a balance that we have to make sure that we have that. We have to make sure we don't go too far in the other direction, right? And buy things
Right.
just because it's not something we would read either. Again,
Right.
to me, it's a collection development. You need to make sure you have a good collection development policy.
Absolutely. And then, so I will share this as a parent, and this is something I share with some parents when I have the opportunity to talk about this topic. For whatever reason, and I know what my reasons were, I really tried for a while to tell my kids they could not read the Goosebumps books. What I found out from that is that after that, they really, really wanted, even more than ever, to read the Goosebumps books. So just for whatever it's worth, with parents, I always ask them, be sure that how you handle this with your kids is in a way that you're going to have good conversations. Because if you drive the conversation underground, or you send them looking for, if they know that they can't talk to you about a certain thing, or that you will not let them have this thing, then they're going to go to their friends, and they're going to go to other places you really might not appreciate for the information they're looking for, or to express those ideas and those thoughts. As hard as your kids get older, or it was in my case, they come to that age where you've got to talk about things that certainly were never talked about with my parents. And so you have to learn how to do that. But that is a parent's privilege. It is a parent's responsibility. And it's not up to the library to decide what that family does. But it's also not up to your family to decide what another family does.
Rita, that makes me laugh, because when I was little, our bookmobile driver told my mom that my mom wasn't allowed to decide whether or not I could read a book.
Wow.
And my mom went, well, you're not going to stop her. She was just waiting for her sister to get done with it so she could read it from her sister's closet. So
if you don't know Maggie
And there again,
Townsend,
that's fair.
Maggie Townsend too, her she was an avid reader, and she'll tell you the same story. Back in school then, you could only go to the certain shelves at a certain grade, and she was beyond that grade level of reading, so she wanted chapter books and things like that. And at that time, there was obviously a different librarian here that didn't agree with that. Her mom would come in, who was also a teacher, and check out books for her. It was a big deal. But Maggie will tell you that story like it was yesterday.
And I would say from our schools, that still is an ongoing issue. You always have those kids, and they have, now I'm going to not say what is that program that's divided by reading age and level, and the books are all marked, and the children are supposed to, or the students are supposed to read however much within that grade level. And I think that's up to a teacher if they want to do that, but you don't have to say that because they have to do that for school, that they aren't for their own leisure able to read something else. Those are the conversations that I would have if you need to. Our teachers fortunately fall down more on the side of, and our new bookmobile librarian is great. They've been so happy because he likes to get to know what the kids want to read and to get them what they want to read. And if it means he needs to bring something from Dickinson, he does. And so
one thing I think people who challenge things and want to censor things don't get is how self-defeating it is in our culture. Because look when they burned the Slaughterhouse-5 in Drake. I mean, and Vonnegut writes a letter to him, and basically all it says, all you did is increase my sales, because now people want to find out why I can't read this. So in the end, it's like kids. You tell a kid not to smoke while you're smoking in front of them. What are they going to go do? They're going to go smoke.
Or they're going to sit and read the Goosebump book in the library because they know that mom doesn't want to see it come home in their backpack. When I look back on that now, anyway, I have a very different feeling about it than I did at the time. But all right, I think we'll move on here. if I can get my slide to advance. So once again, here's something, I'm not going to read it to you. All of you should know this, the Library Bill of Rights. But if you go out, it will give you a lot of help and support as you're doing your collection development policy. And it really does go, once again, over that idea that you don't include or exclude materials just because of a particular viewpoint. One of the things I find interesting is that libraries, we try really hard to have balanced collections and express more than one viewpoint, but how far do you go with that as well is important. And there is also the import that you're developing your collection for your community. And that is a valid point. Anyone that want to throw out any thoughts about that? And if not, we'll just go on. But it's a matter of balance. This book that I chose here, of course, is Little House on the Prairie. That goes, once again, that's one that's been challenged in various places. It's a much beloved book in this part of the world, of course, in the Dakotas and Minnesota. And when it has been challenged, it is about those old ideas about Native Americans that are expressed there. I do feel, as Mary does, that there's some historical value in what's being expressed there was what those people really did feel at that time. But then you use it for a conversation. This slide is about Banned Books Week, which I really love. I just want to point out to all of you, you don't have to be an ALA member to use the Banned Books Week materials also if you want to have that celebration. They have a different theme every year. I think you know these are bookmarks from a bunch of different years to represent the fact that every year they have a little bit of a different focus or way of helping us look at banning and challenging books. It is, as far as I know, the only national celebration that there is of the freedom to read. It was first launched in 1982 because there was a large increase in bans and challenges at that time. And I wonder if it was so much a large increase as it was a much better tracking of those things happened at that point in time. Of course, it's sponsored by ALA, and they report numbers in different ways. So as we do in our reports, annual reports and other things, I always find it interesting how numbers get reported in a different way in different places. So I've deliberately used two different ones. So in 2019, there were 377 challenges in US libraries. That's challenges across all different kinds of things.
Like your Bible? Oh, state library.
Yeah.
Wrong library.
Okay. In 2020, there were 273 books that were challenged. There were a few fewer challenges, and the number of books will not equal up to the number of challenges for various reasons. So they report both of those kinds of things. And there have been actually 1,445 authors that have been banned or challenged over the course of the last decade. So that's actually a lot of people's expression that people have taken issue with, I guess we would say.
Rita, do you know how the number of challenges in 2020 compared to 2019?
And I had that, and do I have it in
I
front?
did find it, but so I can't play. I can play it here, but it won't do
Mary?
sound.
Mary, could you mute yourself? Thank you.
I don't have that number right in front of me. It
That's
is
fine.
out
I
there on
can
the
go out
ALA
and look at
site.
it.
I thought there would probably be a lot less, and this is my memory and not a direct comparison, but there was a lot of challenges that happened, and they were somewhat for different reasons during 2020. But I would encourage you to go out and look at that number. I'm not going to say because I'm not positive. Where are we at here? So one of the things we talk about bans and we talk about challenges, and it's easy to think of those as being the same thing, but they really aren't. So when we're talking about that, what are we talking about? A ban is the actual act of restricting or denying access to something. And it's often controlling content to maintain the power over what people think and use and participate in. It is the actual suppressing of opinions or thoughts, or a person's ability to be exposed to new ideas. To me, at least, I tend to think of banning as being the negative and challenges being actually potentially a very positive thing. So a challenge is not, a banning is a final decision. A challenge is a process. So a challenge is when you have generally starting with a complaint or a request to ban, but it helps you to examine the inclusion of content in a collection. It should and could encourage discussion and questions and learning about different viewpoints. It raises awareness of issues. Most challenges do not lead to bans. And that's, of course, on the local body that engages that process. So I would just say to you as a library, it's important that you know what your process is, and that even your citizens know what the process is to challenge something, and that you have that lined out in a way that will make sure that you do have a process that includes that robust engagement and raising awareness. I used Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn here for the reason that Mary already pointed out. That has been challenged many times because it has old expressions, particularly towards people of color, that are offensive. And but it does allow for the discussion that how we think about that word and use it today. Was it the way it was used then? And because of things like this, we have become aware. So it has had its use, but needs some careful thought in what did this mean then, and what does it mean now, and what have we learned along the way because of this. If that makes sense. So why do people challenge? And these are the main reasons they do. I'll say right now, the 3 pictures that we have over here are all books that used to be in that locked cabinet that I was talking about at our library, and have been moved out and put onto the shelves. But reasons generally include LGBTQIA plus content. That's a lot of letters for important concepts, and that's been the largest reason for book challenges, particularly in recent years, and program challenges. We all know about the story times that have been challenged and other things like that. But other reasons, that sexually explicit, and there is where I feel like there's room for conversation and decisions. Because something can be expressed does not mean that it ought to be included. There are things that you would not include in an elementary school library, for instance, that absolutely do belong in your adult section at the public library. Obscenity or profanity and how people view that as a reason, violence, religious viewpoints, all the time. But what's important, I think, is to know that within all of those things, when we're talking about them, the unspoken factor is diversity. Most of the time when you see challenges, there is a diverse viewpoint being expressed that makes some people uncomfortable. So North Dakota has had challenges. It's had challenges to programs and displays, as we know. And here are a couple of books that I know went through formal challenges. Most of you have heard about Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. We actually had that author at NDLA the year after that happened. A more recent one that many people maybe don't know about is the author Sarah Dasson, and that was actually at the middle school here in Dickinson. And I wanted to point those out because we have some new things in book challenges that even 10 years ago you didn't have to deal with. At the middle school, it all got going actually on Facebook. And in the end, the parents dropped and did not follow through the process. In many ways, because they felt like they'd already accomplished what they wanted to, I think. They had gotten their group on Facebook all excited about the fact that these books were included in that library. And they deal, if you're not familiar with those books, they deal with some real sensitive issues regarding suicide, regarding rape, regarding drug use. I'm wanting to be sure that I express correctly what the concerns were. And once again, there's the thought, is every kid who's at that age ready to discuss those topics? And there's where parents need to be concerned. But how do you allow them to be concerned without taking it away from everyone else? One of the interesting things I like to talk to about this, of course, my kids are in their 20s and 30s now. And one of my daughters is now actually a teen librarian. But I had some really interesting conversations as this was going on with both of them, and I was really surprised. They surprised me in where they fell down on the issue. My daughter, who is now the teen librarian, who is normally, I would say, the freest person you've ever met, was the first one to say, okay, but we need to think about the ages of the kids and whether they're ready to deal with these topics. And we talked about that a lot. And then I was very surprised that my younger daughter, who I expected to fall down on the side of this is not, said, you know, if I had a kid that age, and she has read the books herself, they both have, if I had a kid that age who was dealing with bullying at school, or who was dealing, or even knew a friend, for instance, who had someone in their family who had died by suicide, I would want them to be able to read these books, and then I would want to talk to them about it. I think she expressed that she thought it was important for her to have read them and learn some things in a more first-person viewpoint on those topics. So anyway, just to throw that out there, book challenges do happen, even here in North Dakota. And I would be interested to hear what anyone might have to say about, and I know I'm running short on time, I get windy, but we'll do the top 10 right after this. What anyone might have to say about this new world where things like challenges can happen in places like Facebook and outside of the usual way in which we would like to, our structures that we have for addressing a book challenge.
So Rita, since the challenge took place on Facebook and they didn't follow the proper channels, it's technically not a challenge that would be tracked by ALA because there was no official challenge. Is that correct?
That is correct, except that there was a point at which the parent in question, because they had been someone from the school, the principal had reached out to them, that parent in question did come in and did talk with the school administration, did take away that form that they fully expected her to fill out for a challenge. And in the end, she did not follow through with.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Where do you fall with that on tracking too? And how do we be sure that we're part of those discussions when it's specifically books in the library itself and the service of the library itself that is the content of the conversation on Facebook?
Well, it's like I haven't run into one here, but when I was in mine, and I was mainly at the front desk all the time, I had two different people want to challenge books, and it both, in the end, only one followed through. One even went through the paperwork, but their biggest sticking point on both of them is having to put their name on the challenge.
Right.
Is they wanted to challenge anonymously, and it was like, that's not the way it works.
Yep. And so anyway, I do think there's a new world with some of these things that we're just starting to need to come to terms with. So real quickly, with the time I have left, the top 10 this year is a little bit different from previous years. And I think that has to, well, I know that has to do with the civil discourse and issues that have been going on. But here we go, starting from 10. So in number 10 place was The Hate U Give. I only went back to 2015. So this is the third time since 2015 that that book has been on the list. And it is challenged for profanity, and also in this last year, because it's thought to promote an anti-police message. Number 9, The Bluest Eye. That hasn't been on recently. It was years ago, but it came back on the list this year. And again, it depicts child sexual abuse. And some people, just from the title, make assumptions that it has thoughts in our current civil discourse about particularly Black Lives Matter. Of Mice and Men, another one that hadn't been on recently, but it comes around from time to time. And this is another one that goes back in time, and it has racial slurs and stereotypes. The concern that was expressed is that it has a negative effect on students. And I did include the film version here on the slide as well. To Kill a Mockingbird. This is the second time in the last 5 years that it has been on the list. And again, racial slurs. There was the challenge that said it features a white savior, which is another more recent part of our racial discourse. And it also challenged it, saying that it promotes a particular perception of the Black experience that is not perhaps relevant to everyone. New book, and not surprising that we see it this year, Something Happened in Our Town, a child's story about racial injustice. And it was challenged because they thought it was divisive, and also that it promotes anti-police views. The most challenged book of the last decade, actually, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. Of course, that has been challenged based on sexuality and profanity. But more recently, just in the last year or two now, it has also been challenged because of the author and allegations that have been made against him. So another one of those things that we don't always think about with censorship and challenges, that it's not just about the book itself, but it's also many times about the author or the person who wrote it. Number 4, Speak by Lori Halsey Anderson. This has been challenged because of its political viewpoint, also because they say it promotes a bias against male students. And it does deal with the topics of rape and profanity. The next 2 books are both new, in particular this year, and they happen to both be co-authored by Jason Reynolds. I will say I got to hear him at a keynote for ALA, and if you ever have the opportunity to listen to that man speak, don't miss it. He is a natural storyteller. So that's my little prompt for Jason Reynolds, regardless of what you think about these books. But one of them, this is All American Boys. And of course, it deals with the young Black male experience of life, and includes profanity, drug use, alcoholism. They thought that the topics were too divisive, also anti-police. And one challenge in particular, and this is in quotes, said it is too much of a sensitive matter right now, which I thought was an interesting way of expressing that. And then at number 2, another one that Jason Reynolds co-authored, Stamped: Racism, Anti-Racism, and You. And it's the same sort of complaints as made about the last one. Particularly, there was a complaint or a challenge that said that storytelling includes selective instances, and they thought it was not complete enough. There was also a challenge saying that it did not encompass racism against all peoples. So they felt that it wasn't as inclusive as it should have been in that discussion even. And then we have George at number 1. It's been on the list for the last 5 years. It has been the number 1 challenge year book the last 3 in a row. And of course, that is an LGBTQIA+ book. There have been challenges that say it conflicts with a religious or viewpoint, and they would say it tries to portray a particularly religious viewpoint. There's also the one in quotes, it does not reflect the values of our community. And anyway, that's George. And let's see, do I have anything else here at the end? Because we talked about the links between censorship and then copyright. Here are my resources that I used while I was putting together this presentation. At the bottom, that podcast Brunch Club is going back to their last September's list. But if you are at all interested in listening, there are some great viewpoints from other countries, from France and from New Zealand. And so it's just a terrific listening list. So there I went kind of fast into the last minute, as I always tend to do, but does anybody have any questions or anything else they'd like to contribute to the discussion?
Rita, I have one comment if I could.
Yeah, please.
Just kind of another viewpoint that could lead to a challenge that I've run across. Not that it was actually challenged because we talked through it, but many times when we're ordering, depending on where we're getting our contact or content information or our reviews, different resources have very different descriptions of book contents. You could get 3 totally different descriptions. And if you didn't have all 3 of those, you would never know what was really in that book, because according to just one, it was the perfect book. And then you read another one and it's like, oh my God, I didn't know that was in there. So a lot of times too, it can come back to just not having enough resources when we're looking at some of those books for our local libraries, like you said, to make it liable for our own patrons. So
Right.
just another viewpoint.
Absolutely. And also you want to be mindful, depending on your source, many of those book reviews are geared towards or wanting to prejudice you towards buying a book. So you got to be mindful of where that source came from. Yeah, very good point. Thank you. Other thoughts?
Rita, I just want to thank you for a really great presentation on this topic. It was, I think, the right level of thoroughness and discussion and really thought-provoking. So thank you very much for taking time out of your day to present this for us.
You're welcome, and thank you. I love to talk about it. I think you know that. Couple of things to point out. If you do have a challenge of any kind, reach out. I'm happy to help you, but there's also a link on the NDLA page that goes directly to where you can report and ask for assistance. And once again, just to say, you don't have to be a member to make the use of those resources. All right, I will stop sharing my screen here and say thank you all for your time.